Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of At the Boundary, the podcast from the Global and National Security Institute at the University of South Florida. I'm Jim Cardoso, Senior Director for GNSI and your host for At the Boundary. This will be our last planned episode of 2024. It's been a nonstop year of growth and activity at GNSI, and the team will take a well-deserved holiday break to rest up for what will be a busy 2025. Over the past year, we hosted 5 major conferences covering topics such as artificial intelligence in the era of strategic competition, envisioning peace in the Middle East, and rethinking Afghanistan going forward. We took ownership of the Journal of Strategic Security, a top 20 military journal, and in partnership with USF Libraries, published 4 issues under the GNSI banner. We published 12 monthly decision briefs to concisely inform policymakers on the key issues of the day, as well as longer research articles on Iran-Israel conflict and resistance in Venezuela. We also stood up the Future Strategist program, providing outside-the-classroom experience to inspire and prepare students for careers in global and national security. That's just the tip of the iceberg of activity, and there'll be lots more to come next year. Today, we'll listen as Dr. Tad Schnaufer, Strategy and Research Manager at GNSI, interviews Dr. Stephen Roach. Dr. Roach is Professor of International Relations at USF School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies. Among his many accomplishments, he was country expert on USAID's Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance Work Team in South Sudan. This experience helped fuel his latest book, South Sudan's Fateful Struggle, Building Peace in a State of War. Stephen and Tad will use his book as a framework to discuss how Sudan's comprehensive peace agreement was supposed to bring an end to their second civil war by creating an autonomous southern state, but failed to resolve the effects of rebel factionalism, party infighting, and corruption.
Hey, welcome, Stephen, to the podcast.
Thank you, Ted.
So today we're going to be talking about your book on South Sudan, and it really seems like, looking across the literature and that this book really has a great fit in filling a gap between what happens before the Civil War, what happened after, and kind of giving that history and background. Is that the purpose? Is that why you wrote it?
Yeah, that was the purpose, really, to provide a comprehensive book looking back from what has occurred right at the present all the way as far back as about the 1820s, which is actually a little further back than where most people start, in fact, really to the slave trade and whatnot. So I sort of made a couple of determinations as to where to start on that, and that slave trade, but also just the Ottoman Empire oppression and what was going on in terms of those dynamics was really critical to understand just where the southern Sudanese identity began to emerge. So there's kind of an implicit message there was to try to trace the southern Sudanese identity. You got to go all the way back to that time. And one could even take it back further than that, certainly. But I think in terms of just having a book that is, comprehensive but not too long about South Sudan, that would be it.
Yeah, because you just don't see that many books in South Sudan, particularly, and then one that covers everything is a great addition. But before that, what got you interested in South Sudan, and what's your experience with it personally?
Yeah, so I first went back to South Sudan in 2013 with a close friend and colleague who had actually been doing some work on it, and he got me very interested in it. My initial interest actually sort of lied in a master's thesis on Sudan, but I didn't know that much really about the southern region itself. There was a lot of focus on the Arab forces, the NIF, for instance, and the emergence of Omar al-Hassan Bashir. But I really didn't know that much about the Christian South, and my friend did, who's also a Christian, but also is somebody who really was interested in the politics of the South, what had emerged in terms of a new state. So we went back together in 2013, the summer, which was a period in which there was relative stability, which is actually very scarce to say.
As we'll find out.
Precisely. But we felt the tensions that were emerging even in that summer of 2013. The vice president had just been sacked by the president, and that was a big deal. And that would later come into play in terms of a rebellion on December 15th, 2013, just 6 months later, actually. And then, of course, we came back to South Sudan. We made the decision to try to publish an article on South Sudan and the independence and self-determination and the success of the regime. But when civil war broke out, of course, that all changed. We began to look at what the failure was, and we started to sort of derive it from the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, which had brought in peace to Sudan in 2005, had brought an end to the second civil war in Sudan. And then ultimately we came back in 2016, just after Salva Kiir had driven out Machar from Juba. It was a very violent conflict. And it was one in which people lost their lives, and some humanitarian workers, in fact, and one UN worker actually lost their life. And there was a lot of attention paid to South Sudan at this time. It was the end of a very brief period of peace that was worked out in the first agreement on the resolution of conflict in South Sudan, or ARCSIS. And this summer was critical. We saw a difference in South Sudan that we hadn't seen before. That difference was that the people now were very, very tense, and there was more thievery, there was more chaos on the streets. It was very difficult to walk. We like to walk on the streets a little bit more than what the humanitarian workers would do. And later my contemporaries and my cohorts in USAID, which I would go on to work with and as a country expert in 2019, 2020, just before the pandemic. So we were able, I got recruited by them to perform expertise that, in this case, finally took me out of Juba, and I was able to get to the different cities in the north and also the south of South Sudan, which really, in this case, brought a different perspective on things, the people and whatnot. And we engaged in hundreds of interviews. We did surveys. We conducted focus groups. We looked at, in this case, the success of some of the work that USAID was doing in some of these cities, and also looking at UN compounds where there were prisoners of civilians. The UN, in this case, was focused pretty much on just protecting civilians at this point, and not state building per se. And that really gave me the practical experience, and so I became much, much more deeply interested in writing a book. And this book was the product, really, of those trips and primarily my USAID experience. I felt, behooved to write something about that experience, especially having interviewed so many people and met so many interesting people, the local people and whatnot.
Well, and in the book, you start off going back to that history piece. So why don't we take a look at those, in a sense, those first couple chapters, going back to the Ottoman times and then the Egyptian and British rule and colonialization over the Sudanese.
Yes, and so I felt that the Ottoman Empire was a good place to start. In the 1820s, 1830s, we began to see what would ultimately become more of a conflict between the Arabs and some of ultimately what would become the Christian South. At this time, we began to see how some of the indigenous leaders of Sudan were jockeying for power, emerging, in this case being appointed by the Ottomans to rule some of their local affairs. And ultimately, most importantly, by the 1870s, 1880s, there was a nationalist movement that emerged, the Mahdi movement, which was the first real indigenous Sudanese nationalist group to emerge in that area. And they drove out the British. They drove out this premier and very well-known commander, last name Gordon, who really was very much spearheading the movement to Christianize the area and to try to sort of not move out Islam, but in this case to try to set up a larger area that would pressure the Arab by, in this case, Christianizing more of the South and more of some of the North. But when he did this, in this case, he actually inspired a lot of people to go back to their Islamist roots, and that's where the Mahdi, in this case, emerged.
Well, why did Sudan's a large country, and why did Islam take more hold up north in northern Sudan, and then the Christians more in the south? Was there something that divided that land?
There, in Khartoum, there was more where the Nile meets the White and the Blue Nile meet. There was more of what we'd like to call sort of an Islamic influence, maybe even a civilization up there. And there was also a lot of trading that went on, in which, in this case, the Islamic traders, and was still permitted, and still in this case something that slave trading, in other words, was something that was still permitted by some of the Islamists or the Arabs that were actually conducting some of the trade in that area. And so they were kind of counted on to sort of do that kind of work, or in this case, to perpetuate it. And this, again, just began to rub up against what the British began to do in their very early stages of ultimately colonizing the area, which was to not only Christianize the South, to send evangelical groups down into the South, but to also, in this case, control some of the trade routes for ivory and other very important natural resources. And so really, ultimately what it came down to was that the North began to establish an identity as sort of an Islamic identity, primarily because of some of the Arab values and Arab influence that concentrated itself inside the large city of Khartoum. And ultimately the South was left very undeveloped. The South was just a country where even prior to the 1870s, there really wasn't any sort of Southern identity to speak of. There were just tribal groups that were living in relative peace with one another, some skirmishes, but nothing in this case that was on a violent scale. And so there was nothing really, in this case, to speak of in terms of a Southern identity. The North, in this case, was really Islamist and really Arab, primarily because of those factors that I mentioned. And the British had to play off that. But the British felt that they had an opportunity in the South to, in this case, rival, if not pressure, or I should say further control the North. And that was, in this case, to ultimately impose what would become known as the indirect rule in the South under their colonial empire, under their condominium with Egypt. It was called the Anglo-Egyptian Condominium, in which, in this case, there was sort of a partnership between the two powers to control the affairs and rule over the area that was controlled, primarily all the way down to some of the southern areas of southern Sudan, like the Bahr el Ghazal, but these areas were very, very uncivilized or not controlled by any sort of outside force. It was all very much indigenous in that sense.
Right, limited infrastructure, not a lot of roads. It's just hard to get to as well. And now, what would the British interests? So we're talking like late 1800s now. Obviously, oil hasn't been discovered in South Sudan yet. That obviously that's going to play a factor later on in our discussion, and you touched on it in the book. But what was the British interest into another limited extent, Egypt being a client state of the British at this time, but working with them? What are their interests in Sudan at this time?
Yeah, it primarily was ivory. The ivory trade was very big at this time, but also in this case, getting control over some of the trade routes of other essential commodities. But gaining control over the Nile really meant, in this case, controlling the trade routes all the way, from the Mediterranean Sea all the way down into Africa, and really, in that sense, taking control of a very important chunk of the African continent. And mind you, at this time, there was finally sort of the emergence of the unofficial policy of colonialism in the 1885 agreement, which in this case essentially carved out all of Africa amongst
the Berlin
most
Conference,
of it.
right?
Yeah, the Berlin Conference of 1885. And Britain played a very important role with that, and they were trying to use their control over the Nile to try to make more inroads.
From Egypt to South Africa, right?
Yes.
So they had a pretty good stretch there.
Yes.
But with that, going in a little bit deeper, so how are they able to play different ethnic groups and religious groups off each other to maintain control? Because the British are well known for doing this across Africa and other regions of the world as well, to maintain that informal control. And then how does that play on the identities of the Sudanese?
Yeah, they had the British set up the system where they had these loose patrols that would go out into the hinterlands of southern part of Sudan, which was not very well controlled. But they would send out these patrol systems, and these patrols would either instigate conflict between the different ethnic groups, that then they would play an intermediary role in terms of conflicting, so they've gained control over the conflict that they actually created. And also making deals with chiefs of these tribal groups, trying to, in this case, become closer to one ethnic group over another, treating one, in this case, as, let's say, a little bit more superior than the other. This was a classic facet of colonialism, and especially under British colonialism. So what ultimately ended up being the case is that a lot of the British Empire began to place more emphasis on establishing and brokering relations with the Dinka, the real majority group. And the Nuer was the other minority group, sort of got the short end of the stick and began to not get the sort of privileges that the British would provide. Monetary privileges, other sorts of privileges that would sort of explain how the dynamic of conflict between the different ethnic groups began to really emerge at this time. So when we talk about the politicization of tribal conflict, one can really sort of point to these early stages of the condominium, or in this case, British colonialism in that area, under indirect rule, and these patrols, these governing patrols that would go out to the different sort of outer reaches of the different southern parts. That brings us up sort of to the point, the very sort of first critical point in the 20th century, where you got Egyptian independence. And when you got Egyptian independence, then of course you began to see really the emergence of a South and North identity in Sudan. And that was played out in a way in which the Sudanese nationalists, who emerged primarily in the 1920s, taking inspiration from the El Mahdi movement earlier on. There, I think, were still some El Mahdi leaders that were still around and able to sort of provide some influence in that regard, that they took inspiration from the Egyptian nationalists. And it wasn't as if the Sudanese and Egyptian nationalists were working really closely together, but they were, in this case, working in a way in which they found a common enemy, which was the British. Right. And now, of course, much of it fell to the Sudanese nationalists to work out some sort of agreement. So the British were trying to Sudanize. They had this policy called Sudanization of the area to try to control it. And that meant, in this case, controlling some of the military in that area through various deals that they would put together, but also the educational system. But primarily, as I had suggested, what they did ultimately was to sort of privilege the Sudanese rulers in the north, or focus more attention on them in terms of providing them more educational opportunities and other sorts of infrastructural benefits, such as roads and other sorts of things that would actually develop the country. So they really were focused on development in the north. In the south, it was really about sort of essentially giving sort of the meat and scraps to the south, providing no real substantive remedy to the South, not trying to develop it, in short, trying to keep it oppressed, trying to keep it undeveloped in ways in which they could control it further. But as they did that, what they did is they drove a wedge between the North and the South. And ultimately, in this case, they would help sort of spur a new Southern movement, because the Southern movement now saw also their enemy in the North. Their enemy in the North was about ready to take over the state, and they eventually did, and ultimately that would play out in a way in which the new Sudanese state would become sort of the new enemy for the North. But this all was, in this case, building what we would like to call a national consciousness in the Southern. It wasn't nearly as systematic, as well-formed as we saw in the North, but it was starting to emerge in the 1950s through various events.
Yeah, so going back to the beginning of that piece, you have the late 1800s, you have the British there, you have people like Winston Churchill and other people who have these experiences in Sudan. The British Empire is very far-flung at that time, but towards the end of World War II, jumping forward, 60 years to the end of World War II, 1945, the British Empire is waning. They're losing control of a lot of their colonial territories. A lot of independence movements are on the rise, and then Sudan's able to achieve independence in 1955. So what's that look like in the World War II timeframe for Sudan as it's starting to go towards independence? And again, that dual identity within, again, Sudan is a large nation, but you have this the Sudanese that are in the north, which are more Islamic, based out of Khartoum, and then you have the Sudanese in the south that are more Christian. Again, a lot of ethnic groups in there too. We'll discuss those, as you mentioned, with the Dinkas and the Nur, but focused in Juba.
Yeah. So the policy of Sudanization worked for the North. There was much more military discipline that was actually conferred onto the military in the North. And in essence, benefited from that. And it would actually get them to realize that they had the kind of capabilities as a group to oppose the British Empire, that they could sort of rise up just like the Egyptian nationalists did earlier on to oppose the British. And really, there was also one other thing I should mention with regards to this emergence of Sudanese nationalism, but ultimately how it led to a new state. The partnership, or I should say the loose kind of friendly ties that they had with the Egyptian nationalists was such that even by the mid-1930s, Egypt still did not have full control, or the Egyptian state didn't have full control over a lot of its bases, a lot of areas, Suez Canal, for instance. So the Sudanization policy provided this sort of lever for the Sudanese nationalists to begin to really pressure the British to the point where, to pick up what you had talked about, to make it no longer in their interest to control the area. They found it too expensive to do so. They didn't have the public support back at home anymore about maintaining their colonial presence in that area. There were a lot of factors that came into play in terms of ultimately the British relenting and simply sort of standing back and then handing over the reins to the Sudanese nationalists. So it was a relatively peaceful transition of power, actually. Sudanese independence. The British really sort of stepped aside and just sort of handed them the reins, and that sort of that point in time was definitive, I think, for how the relations between the South and the North would play out.
Because we have this divide. Again, it's a religious divide, it's an ethnic divide, it's geography based. Sudan proper has a long coastline on the Red Sea, which makes it pretty strategic, and we see a lot of interface with some of the superpowers during the Cold War because of that as well. But what after independence in 1955, which you said relatively nonviolent independence movement, unfortunately, violence does not remain scarce in Sudan because of the civil war, the first civil war. So what's that look like? How do we go from a relatively peaceful independence movement to over a decade long civil war?
Yeah, the massacre in Torit was crucial for understanding, first of all, the official emergence of a Sudanese nationalist movement, a South Sudanese nationalist movement, excuse me. And it was one where you began to see the split between those who wanted some type of autonomous agreement honored or some type of autonomous unit in the South that would be recognized, and those who would ultimately become more radical and more militarized. Those in this case that believed that peace with South Sudan, or in this case, trust in the Sudanese government, was not something that could be attainable, or in this case was really achievable. What ultimately happened was that we began to see the tensions emerge between these two groups: a militarized group, which would ultimately come known as the Anyana, and a much more moderated group that was led by Lagu. And by 1962, the Anyana sort of declared themselves separate from that movement, and in this case, declared that they wanted to seek secession. And so that was the start of the first civil war in Sudan, when they began to attack government forces, and then there was, of course, military engagement between the Anyana One, we'll call them at this point, and the Sudanese government led by Numeri. And this played out over a long period of time, of course, 10 years. But by the time you get to the early 1970s, the Anyana is getting a little bit tired. People are getting tired of the Anyana in terms of not being able to deliver on their message. And people are not seeing very much progress. And Numeri is starting to make these overtures, Numeri being the president of Sudan at this time, for peace. And so we began to work and sometimes sort of broker these sort of behind-the-scene deals with Lagu, who's the more moderate person still standing, if you will, and still in this case representing a peaceful solution to the conflict, and one in which, in this case, autonomy would be the settlement. And they did reach a negotiation. They were able to, in this case, broker agreement. And there was not too much outside help on this. The United States was still kind of opposed in Nimeri and whatnot. There was a lot of internal agreement between the two. The Anyana agreed, in this case, to disarm and to be retrained into the Sudanese forces. This was something very dramatic. Sure. This was something that maybe signified a new beginning. But it was all for naught, obviously, because the new regional southern government would ultimately collapse and fail, primarily not on its own, but because Nimeri, the president of Sudan, began to orchestrate these plans and these deals and that were very nefarious and very oppressive, and ultimately, by the end, in 1983, Nimeri had reimposed Islamic rule on the South, and that was something that became sort of a battle cry for the Southern rebels, and also, in this case, the coalesced to the Anyana too, but in this case led to something much more important, which was the Sudan People's Liberation Army movement, the SPLA, SPLM. So it was something that also allowed leadership that was more visionary, that was more intellectually rooted, that was much more broad-based, even more populist, if you want to use that term. And that was John Garang Mabur, who had fought with the Sudanese forces as a colonel, and now, in this case, felt betrayed by that Islamic law, but also amongst other things. And he felt, in this case, Nimeri was simply using the South as a pawn to try to gain leverage in the world. So in 1983, May of 1983, they formed the SPLM, Sudan People's Liberation Movement. And that was, of course, an exciting point. The Anyana too sort of eventually got behind the SPLM. And Garang used his influence and his intellect to be able to communicate a message in a manifesto that brought together all the different tribal ethnicities, or in this case, that neutralized the ethnic dimension
for a time.
Existed. For a time. For a time. Not long, but for a time here.
Well, and that's an interesting point as we're getting ready to discuss the second Civil War as we go into the late 1980s into the 1990s. And you have all these different players, and it's one thing throughout the book you cover extremely well is showing that dynamic nature of Sudan's politics, Sudanese politics, and then South Sudan's politics as well. You have all these different groups. You have many different ethnic groups, even the major ones, but you have a lot of competing factors. And then you have people, as we'll discuss here shortly, people who are allied for a short period of time, groups that are fighting together, then they end up fighting each other, then they come back together. Right. And it's a maze that you have to constantly be paying attention on. It's very complex, and it seems like that's something as we get to your policy recommendations, talk a little bit more, but people in the West, it's hard for us to conceptualize such divide and such tribalism in different ethnic groups. Where how do you form a functioning government with so many competing factions? Yeah,
and so ultimately, what happened inside the SPLM was that Garang's holdover broke down, and broke down along ethnic lines. Primarily, in this case, Riek Machar Teni, Riek Machar, or Riek we'll call him, and Lama Col, who's a Shilluk, got together, and they decided that Garang's leadership was not only authoritarian, it was out of touch, but it was also, in this case, not the way forward for the Sudanese people. And they needed more democracy inside the SPLM. They needed these other sorts of things that Garang simply was not providing them, at least from their perspective. And so they staged a revolt in 1991, the Torrid Revolt, and they formed their own SPLM to oppose Garang's SPLM. And so what happened after that, as you had just alluded to, was that Machar broke away from Lama Col by 1993, then formed his own faction, and then ultimately tried to collaborate with Khartoum, the Sudanese forces, against Garang, which of course gives us sort of the South-on-South war in that regard. And this kind of went back and forth until about 1998 or the 1999, when Garang, in this case, was no longer Garang had lost his appeal, became sort of persona non grata within his own movement, and Garang recognized that and ultimately brought him back into the fold after Machar pleaded with him to come back into the SPLM that was run by Garang in 2001. And so there was unity again back in SPLM after about a 10-year period. And 10 years, a decade, I guess that's one of those sort of, important magical markers here. And then that got the international community interested. People began to see Garang as somebody that they could actually back, somebody that was actually a Democrat, somebody in this case that was a unifying figure, that was even a liberal figure, was somebody that in this case espoused a lot of liberal Western values. And so the West got behind him. And when they did, in this case, they got together, and in this case formed the Troika, which was the United States, Norway, and Britain, to mediate the negotiations, all the different agreements, protocols that ultimately came together in what was called the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005. Worked out border disputes, not entirely. They left open, in this case, some of the border disputes, especially in Abyei, which was very important. But they did actually settle on a provision in which the southern people would get their autonomy and also a choice as to whether or not to stay autonomous within the existing state of Sudan or to, in this case, succeed. And so there was a big push by Garang initially to further unity with Sudan. And he called this sort of the new Sudan. And the new Sudan would be a democratic, unified Sudan, one that, in this case, did not discriminate along religious or ethnic lines, so it was very secular in that sense. Unfortunately, Garang lost his life in 2005 in a helicopter crash, which was somewhat mysterious circumstances, the summer of 2005, not long after the Comprehensive Peace Agreement had been signed. So that passed the reins on to Salva Kiir, his sort of second in command. And Salva Kiir, as some people might know, is still the president of South Sudan. So he's been in charge for quite some time. So he initially did support Garang's vision of a new Sudan. But by 2008, it was clear that the Sudanese government was not entirely to be trusted. And he began to realize that the SPLM had to consolidate itself. And so we pushed for elections, and so we got elections, ultimately after some delays, and rain delays, put it that way, into 2010. And there was elections that a lot of people criticized. They felt that the SPLM was manipulating the elections, not ballot stuffing, but in this case intimidating people to not vote and whatnot. So they kind of strong-armed the elections and consolidated, and they wanted to do that because they wanted to show the rest of the world that they were in charge, they were in power, and they could, in this case, move to the next step, which in this case was secession, and which is what they did. The secession flowed naturally out of the elections, and it was agreed to, and they eventually did so in January of 2011.
So, and this book published late in 2023. So we've kind of covered what has happened since with the postponement elections. That's where you pretty much leave off, is that, hey, the elections are, were set for 2024, but they got postponed. They got postponed again in 26. But what, to kind of wrap up this concept and going to the title of the book, Building Peace in a State of War. So what's that look like now for South Sudan?
Right. It means, one, the only way to get rid of the violence is to focus a little bit more on the intercommunal violence outside the cities. You get raging conflicts. You have a lot of militias, non-governmental militias, that are in effect being financed by outside sources that are attacking the civilian populations and that are really causing a lot of mayhem, a lot of violence, which the government simply cannot control fully, which suggests in this case that you do need more outside help to try to provide the government with the capabilities to be able to control that intercommunal violence. Because, in fact, it is in the government's interest to do so. And they would do so if they had the finances, but they don't. Soldiers are not paid. Their salaries usually deferred, or they're paid only $15 a month. In this case, and it's very, very minimal. There's almost no incentive to fight on the government side. So the government needs, of course, the resources to be able to pay more their servants. But again, this gets us back to corruption, right, in terms of how much money actually has making it into.
So how do you break the loop? I mean, if you have outside aid coming in, more resources, but the government's corrupt, it's not just, it's got to be resources with some sort of conditions or something to be able to incentivize like President Kiir to take a risk on democratizing or...
The question is whether or not you can do it with Kiir in power. And, my opinion on that is that I don't think you can do it with Kiir in power. And I don't think you can with a lot of the existing elites. The status quo has not worked, and it hasn't worked for that country for many years, but yet we keep on falling back on it. Right. What you would need, and this requires new thinking. This requires something where if you're going to have a vision for the country of peace and democracy, you're going to have some rethinking of the contract between the people and the government, because this was never, in this case, discussed in any way that would suggest that South Sudan had a long-term vision.
We hope you enjoyed this intriguing conversation between Dr. Stephen Roach, author of South Sudan's Fateful Struggle, Building Peace in a State of War, and GNSI Strategy and Research Manager, Dr. Tad Schnaufer. With all the headlines focused on the Middle East, Ukraine, and the Far East, it's important to take into account instability in Africa and consider its effect on regional and global security. Thanks for joining us today. If you like the podcast, please share with your colleagues and network. You can follow GNSI on our LinkedIn and X accounts at USF_GNSI. And check out our website as well at usf.edu/GNSI. From the entire team at the Global and National Security Institute, we wish you, your family, and your friends the most wonderful of holiday seasons. We can't wait to rejoin you on January 13th with more interesting guests, deep analysis, and an unwavering commitment to keep you informed on what's going on in the world of global and national security. So, in an adjustment to my normal closing, that's going to wrap up this year of At the Boundary. Next year, we'll continue to feature global and national security issues we found to be insightful, intriguing, fascinating, maybe controversial, but overall, just worth talking about. I'm Jim Cardoso, and we'll see you in 2025 at the Boundary.